Rome, a city that shimmered with gold and decay, its ancient thoroughfares thick with the scent of incense and corruption. In the very heart of the Vatican, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, surveyed his domain with a predator's gaze. The papal tiara, heavy with its jewels, rested on his brow, a burden he nevertheless bore with evident relish. For years he had schemed, bribed, and relentlessly clawed his way to the hallowed throne of St. Peter. And now, at long last, the Holy See was unequivocally his. The Borgias were not noble by birth, but they were ruthless by nature. Rodrigo's ascent had been fueled by a sprawling network of alliances, each pact sealed with Spanish gold and whispered, dangerous promises. Cardinals who dared to oppose him found their influence inexplicably waning, or, more ominously, their lives cut abruptly short. The papal court, once a purported bastion of piety, had been transformed into a den of overt vice, where vast fortunes were won and lost over games of chance and the fleeting favors of courtesans. At the very center of it all stood Lucrezia, Rodrigo's daughter, a vision of golden hair and porcelain beauty. Though barely 16, she was already a significant pawn in her father's grand dynastic designs. Her laughter often echoed through the Vatican's gilded halls, yet behind her radiant smile lay the keen, sharp mind of a player in a perilous game she had not chosen. Beside her loomed Cesare, her brother, a young cardinal with the cold, calculating eyes of a wolf, and ambitions that seemed to outstrip even his father's. The initial whispers began subtly, like tendrils of smoke, thin and insubstantial, yet utterly impossible to ignore. They curled through Rome's bustling taverns, slipped slyly between the lips of courtiers in the Vatican's hushed antechambers, and seeped into the ink of anonymous pamphlets left in the piazzas at dawn. The daughter shares the father's bed. The brother's gaze lingers too long. No one could definitively say who first spoke such words, but they spread through the city with the swiftness of a plague. The Borgia's enemies needed no concrete proof, only scandal, something vile enough to erode the family's tightening grip on power. Soon, crudely printed woodcuts appeared overnight, depicting twisted, almost grotesque embraces, their figures just vague enough to avoid outright libel, yet unmistakable in their malicious intent. Rodrigo's jowled face, Cesari's sharp features, Lucrezia's flowing hair, all rendered in a horrifying caricature. The accompanying text was even worse, verses dripping with innuendo, sacred prayers twisted into obscenity. O Holy Father who art in bed, unhallowed be thy name. Lucrezia, walking through the Vatican gardens with her ladies, would find them falling silent as she approached, their eyes darting swiftly away. Even the servants whispered behind their hands. She was no fool. She knew precisely what they said, but to acknowledge the rumors would be to grant them power. Cesare, ever the wolf, reacted differently. He cornered a printer in the dead of night, his dagger pressing into the man's throat until he named his patron, a minor courtier paid to distribute the filth. The printer's lifeless body was discovered floating in the Tiber the next morning, his tongue gruesomely cut out. The message was chillingly clear, but the damage was already done. Scandal, once unleashed, cannot be so easily sheathed. Rodrigo, for his part, dismissed it all with a dismissive wave of his ringed hand. "Let the dogs bark," he told Lucrezia, his voice thick with the aftertaste of wine. "They merely envy what they cannot have." Yet his feigned nonchalance only fueled further speculation. Why would a pope, God's representative on earth, not rage against such slander, unless the rumors held some terrifying grain of truth? The whispers grew sharper like teeth. At a lavish banquet hosted by Cardinal Orsini, a rival faction, a poet recited verses laden with double meaning, his eyes flickering toward Lucrezia as he spoke of flowers plucked too soon. The room erupted in stifled laughter. Lucrezia, her cheeks burning with humiliation, kept her chin defiantly high. But later, in the privacy of her chambers, she shattered a vase against the wall with a furious crash. Cesare found her there, kneeling amidst the sharp shards. "They will pay," he promised, his voice a cold blade unsheathed. But mere payment was not enough. The whispers had taken deep root, and in the shadows of Renaissance Rome, where truth and lies were equally potent currency, the most dangerous stories were always the ones people desperately wanted to believe. Incest was the unforgivable sin, the ultimate violation of nature, the corruption of bloodlines, the unraveling of divine order itself. In a world where the church tirelessly preached purity and the sanctity of family, no accusation carried more destructive weight. For the Borgia's enemies, that made it the perfect, most potent weapon. Rome had long tolerated the vices of its rulers: bribery, murder, even the open flaunting of mistresses. But incest, that was fundamentally different. It was a sin so monstrous it could not be spoken aloud in polite company, yet so tantalizing it spread like wildfire in the dark. The Borgias were already reviled for their Spanish blood, their insatiable greed, their brazen nepotism, but the whispers of incest transformed them from mere sinners into something far worse: abominations. And yet the irony was bitter. The Borgias were guilty, just not of this particular sin. Rodrigo had bought the papacy with chests of Spanish gold, securing votes from cardinals whose piety dissolved at the mere sight of coin. Cesare had ordered assassinations with the casual cruelty of a man who believed himself entirely above earthly justice. Lucrezia's marriages were brokered like cold trade agreements, her body a mere bargaining chip in her father's endless games of power. These were sins Rome could understand, even expect, but they were not quite enough to utterly destroy the family. Not like this pervasive rumor could. The pamphlets grew bolder still. One, slipped under the door of a Venetian ambassador, depicted Lucrezia as a modern-day Circe, her arms entwined with both her father and her brother. Another, read aloud in the taverns of Trastevere, spun a salacious tale of a papal key that unlocked far more than just heaven's gates. The Borgia's enemies needed no tangible proof, only the persistent seed of doubt, tirelessly watered by the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. Even the church's own teachings inadvertently fed the flames. Sermons on morality, on the sins of Sodom, on the damnation that awaited those who defiled sacred bonds. All were subtly twisted into veiled condemnations of the Borgias. A Florentine preacher, his voice trembling with righteous fury, spoke of a house where the serpent nests in the marriage bed. He did not name names. He did not need to. Lucrezia, trapped in the eye of this raging storm, became both villain and victim. To some, she was the depraved seductress, the temptress who ensnared her own kin. To others, she was the innocent pawn, corrupted by the very men who should have protected her. The actual truth mattered far less than the compelling story, and the story was simply too delicious to resist. Cesare, ever the strategist, saw the immense danger. "They paint us as monsters," he snarled to his father, "because they cannot defeat us as mere rivals." Rodrigo, reclining in his chambers with a goblet of wine, only chuckled. Let them talk. Words are but wine, but words, as Cesare acutely knew, possess the power to topple empires. The Borgia's true transgressions, their bribes, their murders, their naked ambition, seemed mundane beside the monstrous myth now taking shape, a myth that would inexorably outlive them all. For in the end, history often remembers not precisely what men do, but precisely what others say they did. And Rome was already busily writing the Borgia's epitaph in ink stained with the bitter essence of poison. Lucrezia Borgia was never merely a daughter. She was a key, a finely wrought golden key to the immense vaults of power her father, Alexander VI, sought so desperately to unlock. From the moment she could walk, she had been groomed for a singular, overarching purpose: to serve the Borgia dynasty. But was she a willing participant in her father's elaborate machinations, or simply a pawn moved across the grand chessboard of Renaissance politics? The answer, like so much of her complex life, remained perpetually shrouded in the shadows of the Vatican. Rodrigo Borgia had never been a man to let mere sentiment interfere with his soaring ambition. His love for Lucrezia was genuine. Of that there was little doubt, but it was a love meticulously tempered by cold calculation. She was his most valuable asset, a living jewel to be bartered for alliances, for vast lands, and for crucial influence. By the tender age of 13, she had already been betrothed twice, her hand promised to noblemen whose loyalty could be bought, or whose territories could be absorbed into the ever-expanding Borgia web. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro was a cold, pragmatic transaction. The Sforzas were a powerful Milanese family, and the union effectively secured Alexander's northern interests. But when the unpredictable political winds of Italy abruptly shifted, so too did Lucrezia's fate. The marriage was swiftly dissolved under murky circumstances, Giovanni fleeing Rome in terror, rumors swirling that the annulment hinged on fabricated claims of his impotence, or, even worse, that Alexander had orchestrated the entire ordeal merely to free Lucrezia for a more advantageous match. "You will be a queen," her father had murmured to her when the edifice of that marriage crumbled, his fingers brushing her cheek with deceptive tenderness. Not a countess, not a mere lord's wife. A queen, Lucrezia had bowed her head, her voice steady despite the turmoil. "As you wish, Holy Father." But behind those obedient words, what did she truly feel? Some historians would later paint her as a passive ornament, her will entirely bent to her father's domineering hand. Others would argue she was a keen, intelligent player in the ruthless game, her sweetness a carefully crafted mask for a mind as sharp as any dagger. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between those stark interpretations. Her second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples, was yet another pivotal piece in Alexander's grand, intricate design. Naples was a glittering jewel in the Mediterranean, and with Lucrezia as its future queen, the Borgias would command the south just as they did Rome. But this union, too, would end in blood. Alfonso would tragically not live to see his throne, his body left broken and lifeless in a Roman alley, his killers never formally named but widely, chillingly suspected. It was these rapid-fire marriages, these abrupt and brutal shifts in her fate, that most potently fed the darkest whispers. Why would a father so publicly parade his daughter through a series of betrothals and annulments, unless there was something profoundly unnatural in their bond? The pamphleteers sneered. What groom could truly satisfy a bride already claimed by her own kin? Lucrezia's ladies reported hearing her weep at night, but by dawn she was always meticulously composed, her face a serene mask as she attended Mass at her father's side. Was it resignation? Complicity? Or the steely resolve of a woman who understood that survival in the Borgia court meant playing the game better, more ruthlessly, than anyone else? Alexander, for his part, seemed utterly untroubled by the swirling rumors. When a cardinal dared to allude to the scandal in a consistory meeting, the Pope's laughter boomed through the hall, shockingly brazen. "Do you think I would share such a treasure with any man, even my own son?" The jest was calculated, brazen enough to mock the accusation, yet laced with just enough unsettling ambiguity to leave a chill. In the end, Lucrezia's value to her father was never in question. She was the perfect instrument, beautiful, intelligent, malleable when necessary, and ruthlessly effective when required. Whether she truly embraced her role or merely endured it mattered little to Alexander. The Borgias did not deal in sentimental love. They dealt in absolute power. And power, as Rome was learning, was a far more dangerous and corrupting thing than mere desire. Cesare Borgia moved through Rome like a sharp, unsheathed blade, swift, silent, and deadly. Where his father ruled with gold and cunning guile, Cesare preferred the blunt force of steel. His reputation was carved in blood. He was the cardinal who had cast aside his robes for armor, the Pope's son who commanded armies with the same chilling ease he once recited scripture. But it was his fervent, almost obsessive relationship with Lucrezia that truly set tongues wagging. The siblings were inseparable. Cesare, ever the fiercely protective older brother, hovered constantly at Lucrezia's side, his imposing presence a silent, chilling warning to those who might think to harm or slight her. He escorted her to Mass, lingered conspicuously at her banquets, and dismissed her potential suitors with a mere glance that promised swift violence. To outsiders, their closeness seemed profoundly unnatural, almost unsettling. To the Borgias themselves, it was simply the accepted way of their world. Lucrezia, for her part, seemed to bask in her brother's formidable shadow. Where others saw menace, she saw unwavering devotion. "No one understands him as I do," she once confided to a lady-in-waiting, her voice tinged with a strange pride. "He is not the monster they paint him to be, but Rome knew better, or at least it believed it did." The rumors had begun years earlier, when Lucrezia was still a girl. Whispers that Cesare lingered too long in her private chambers, that his kisses lingered inappropriately on her cheek, that his lavish gifts, jewels, silks, a dagger with a pearl handle, were more fitting for a lover than a brother. The truth, as ever, was murkier than the gossip. Cesare was undeniably possessive, yes, but whether his intense love was merely fraternal or something far darker, none could say with certainty. Even history hesitates to draw a definitive line. What was undeniable, however, was Cesari's pervasive role in Lucrezia's growing list of scandals. Where her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza crumbled, it was Cesare who personally delivered the annulment papers, and Cesare who was widely rumored to have physically threatened Giovanni's life if he refused to sign. When her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was found stabbed to death in a Roman alley, it was Cesari's name that inexorably rose to the surface like a corpse in the Tiber. He would kill for her, the courtiers murmured, their eyes wide with fear and speculation. But would he kill because of her? That terrifying question haunted Lucrezia's already tarnished reputation. Did Cesare eliminate Alfonso purely out of cold political necessity, or was it out of a far more passionate, jealous possessiveness? The timing was damning. Alfonso had been young, handsome, and, critically, beloved by Lucrezia in a way none of her previous suitors had been. Their marriage had been one of rare, genuine affection, a fleeting glimpse of happiness in the Borgias' cutthroat world. And then, abruptly, it ended in a pool of blood. Cesare never openly confessed, but he never denied it either. When pressed by a drunken nobleman at a banquet, he merely smiled, swirling his wine with casual disdain. A man who cannot keep what is his does not deserve to keep it. The nobleman did not utter another word that night. Lucrezia's grief was public, her tears seemingly genuine. But within weeks, she was back at her father's side, her mourning clothes exchanged for vibrant silks, her face a meticulously composed mask. Some said she had simply forgiven Cesare. Others whispered she had known all along. The siblings' bond only seemed to deepen in the chilling aftermath. Cesare, ever the calculating strategist, ensured Lucrezia's next marriage would be to a man of his choosing, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a match that would secure the Borgias' lasting legacy in the north. And Lucrezia, ever the dutiful, beautiful daughter, acquiesced. But Rome never forgot. The rumors festered, fed by Cesari's ruthless reputation and Lucrezia's enigmatic silence. Had they been partners in crime? Had their bond truly crossed the line from fierce loyalty into something unspeakable? The truth, like so much of the Borgias' lives, was buried beneath layers of relentless power, insidious propaganda, and the silent effectiveness of poison. But one thing remained chillingly certain. In the formidable shadow of Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia was both fiercely protected and irrevocably imprisoned. She was a queen on a chessboard where every single move was dictated by blood. And blood, as the Borgias knew better than anyone, was the one thing that never truly washed clean. The banquet hall glittered like a vast, gilded cage. Candles dripped wax onto ornate silver platters, their flames casting long, flickering shadows across the intricately frescoed walls. Pope Alexander VI sat at the head of the immense table, his booming laughter echoing as he raised a jeweled goblet to his lips. Around him, Rome's most powerful men feasted, cardinals in their opulent crimson silks, nobles with their rings flashing, all of them blissfully unaware that they were now players in a deadly, silent game. This was the Borgia table, and not all who dined would live to see the dawn. Lucrezia, draped in rich emerald velvet, presided over the feast with practiced, elegant grace, her delicate fingers brushing the stem of her wine glass, her lips curved in a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Beside her, Cesare lounged with the predatory ease of a panther, his gaze sharp and sweeping across the room, missing nothing. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, and something else, something subtly acrid, lurking beneath the heavy perfumes. The first to falter was Cardinal Orsini. His face, already flushed from wine, turned ashen. He clutched his stomach, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I feel unwell," he muttered, but his words were utterly lost in the general din of laughter and conversation. By the time his body hit the marble floor, convulsing violently, the servants were already moving forward, not to help, but to discreetly, efficiently drag him away. The music played on, undisturbed. One by one, others began to sway. A young lord wretched uncontrollably into his plate. A bishop clawed frantically at his throat, his eyes bulging in terror. The poison worked swiftly, a silent assassin delivered in the wine, the bread, the sugared fruits. Some said it was Cantarella, the Borgia's signature brew, a concoction so devilishly refined it left no trace, only corpses. Lucrezia watched it all, her expression serenely composed. When Cesare leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, she did not flinch. "They should not have crossed us," he murmured. She sipped her wine. "No, they should not have by dawn. 6 men were dead." The official story would conveniently blame bad shellfish, a tragic accident. But Rome knew better. The whispers spread like wildfire through the city. The Borgias had purged their enemies in plain sight, feasting as their unsuspecting guests choked on their last breaths. It was not the first such banquet, nor would it be the last. These poisoned feasts became a chilling legend, relentlessly reinforcing the family's monstrous public image. What kind of people murdered under the guise of gracious hospitality? What kind of daughter sat calmly as men died at her very table? The answer was simple. The Borgias were not like other people. They played by their own merciless rules. And woe to those who dared to forget it. As the lifeless bodies were carried away, Alexander raised his glass once more, his smile genial, almost benevolent. "To health," he toasted, and the survivors, trembling with a primal fear, drank. The wedding had been a dazzling spectacle of silk and gold, a brazen display of Borgia power meant to utterly dazzle Rome. Lucrezia, barely 13, had stood before the altar in a gown of exquisite Venetian lace, her small hands clasped in those of Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The groom, twice her age, had smiled with the confident smirk of a man who believed himself truly favored by fortune. He did not yet know his marriage was merely a transaction, one that would end as abruptly as it began, and in whispers darker and more unsettling than the Tiber at midnight. The feast that followed was lavish even by Borgia standards. Wine flowed in abundant rivers, and the tables groaned under the immense weight of roasted peacocks, their feathers meticulously reattached in grotesque, splendid mockery of life. Lucrezia, her face a mask of practiced serenity, accepted toasts from men who eyed her like a coveted prize. Across the vast hall, her father and brother watched, their expressions inscrutable. When the time came for the traditional bedding ceremony, the guests erupted into bawdy cheers. Custom demanded the bride be escorted to the marital chamber, where the marriage would be consummated under the collective gaze of witnesses, serving as public proof of its legitimacy. But as the boisterous crowd surged forward, Alexander raised a commanding hand. "Enough," he declared, his voice cutting sharply through the noise. "My daughter is a child still. Let them retire in peace, The room fell silent, a sudden, stunned hush. It was a clear breach of custom, a blatant refusal to allow Rome to witness the marriage sealed. Giovanni's face darkened with frustration and anger, but he dared not openly protest. Lucrezia was led away by her ladies, her steps measured, her eyes downcast, revealing nothing. Behind closed doors, the truth of what transpired, or critically did not, would become the subject of fevered, rampant speculation. Giovanni would later vehemently claim the marriage was consummated. Lucrezia, in the subsequent annulment proceedings, would just as vehemently insist it was not. But the annulment itself was a masterpiece of Borgia cunning. Alexander, needing to sever ties with the Sforzas as Milan's political winds shifted, declared the marriage void on the utterly humiliating grounds of non-consummation. A profound affront for Giovanni, who was forced to sign a document attesting to his own impotence. No man would admit such a thing willingly. Giovanni snarled to his allies after fleeing Rome. "They threatened me. The Pope's own son held a knife to my throat." The rumors took immediate flight. Had Giovanni truly been impotent, as the Borgias claimed, or had something far more sinister prevented the marriage's consummation? Whispers slithered through the streets. Had Lucrezia's father or brother intervened? Had she been deliberately kept untouched for darker, unspoken purposes? The Vatican's official stance was firm. The marriage was invalid, and Lucrezia was free to wed again, supposedly for the good of the Church. But Rome was not so easily convinced. The annulment reeked not just of political maneuvering, but, far worse, of secrets too vile to name. Lucrezia, for her part, said nothing. She withdrew to the convent of San Sisto, her sudden piety raising many cynical eyebrows. Was it genuine grief, shame, or a strategic retreat, allowing the scandal to cool before her next critical role in her father's endless ambitions? Giovanni, stripped of his bride and his pride, would spend years railing bitterly against the Borgias, his fury only fueling the persistent rumors. "They are monsters," he wrote to a fellow noble. "What kind of father annuls his daughter's marriage on such grounds, unless he has other uses for her?" The question lingered unanswered. For Lucrezia, the first wedding night was not a joyous beginning, but a chilling prelude, a stark taste of the betrayals and intricate intrigues that would come to define her entire life. And for Rome, it was chilling proof that in the house of Borgia, even love was a mere weapon. The convent of San Sisto was a world away from the gilded, treacherous halls of the Vatican. Its high stone walls muffled the clamor of Rome, and the clean, austere scent of incense and damp parchment replaced the perfumed decadence of the papal court. Here, Lucrezia Borgia sought refuge, or at least the convincing appearance of it. Her arrival had been swift and unannounced, dressed in simple wool, her famously golden hair hidden beneath a plain veil. She had slipped through the convent's gates like a ghost, an ethereal figure. The abbess, a stern woman with eyes like flint, had welcomed her with wary reverence. This was, after all, the Pope's daughter, a sinner or a saint. The abbess did not dare to guess. The whispers followed her, even here. Behind the convent's cloistered walls, the nuns spoke in hushed tones of the scandal that had driven Lucrezia into their midst. Some pitied her, a child bride cast aside by her husband, seemingly abandoned by her powerful family. Others eyed her with deep suspicion. Why would a girl of her exalted station retreat to such austerity unless she carried a secret too heavy for the world to bear? The rumor took root like a stubborn weed. Lucrezia was with child. It spread through the convent's quiet corridors, carried on the lips of novices who stole furtive glances at her waist. Was it Giovanni Sforza's child, conceived in that brief, hotly contested marriage? Or was it something far darker, a child of profound sin, its origins too vile even to name? The pamphlets circulating in Rome had already painted her as a depraved temptress, a daughter who shared her own father's bed. Now, her sudden, mysterious withdrawal only fueled the inferno of malicious gossip. Lucrezia said nothing. She attended Mass with bowed head, her fingers tight around her rosary beads. She knelt for hours in the cold chapel, her lips moving in silent, fervent prayer. But the nuns noticed how her hands sometimes trembled, how her breath hitched faintly when the bells told the hours. Cesare came once, cloaked and unannounced. The abbess nearly fainted when he strode imperiously into the peaceful courtyard, his heavy boots scattering gravel. He and Lucrezia spoke in low, urgent tones near the fragrant herb garden, their faces closed and unreadable. When he finally left, his expression was thunderous. The very next morning, a physician arrived, a discreet man with no known ties to the Vatican. He examined Lucrezia behind locked doors. The nuns pressed their ears to the thick wood, but heard nothing. When he emerged, his face remained utterly unreadable. The truth, whatever it was, remained perfectly hidden. But Rome's gossips needed no concrete proof. The story took on a life of its own. Lucrezia, the poisoned flower, had been sent away to hide her shame. Some claimed she bore a child in secret, a babe then spirited away to the remote countryside. Others swore she had taken powerful herbs to purge her womb, her sins supposedly washed clean with blood. Alexander VI, when pressed by his cardinals, merely laughed off the rumors with a dismissive wave. "My daughter is pious," he declared. "She seeks solace in God's grace. Would you deny her that?" Yet even his most loyal allies exchanged uneasy glances. The timing was simply too convenient, the whispers far too loud to ignore. Lucrezia remained at San Sisto for months, her absence from court a palpable void filled with rampant speculation. When she finally returned to the Vatican, she was paler, thinner, but her gaze was steady and resolute. The rumors had not broken her. If anything, they had hardened her, forging her resolve. Her enemies watched, waiting for a single misstep. But Lucrezia had learned the most valuable lesson of all. In the bourgeois world, survival was not about innocence or guilt. It was about absolute control. And so she stepped back into the harsh light, her head held high, her secrets buried deep within her. Let Rome whisper, she would outlast them all. The streets of Rome were slick with cold rain the night Alfonso of Aragon died. Lucrezia had wept openly when they brought her the devastating news. Her second husband, the handsome, gentle Alfonso, perhaps the only man she had ever truly dared to love, lay broken in the mud of a dark alleyway, his body brutally pierced by assassins' blades. The killers had vanished like fleeting shadows, leaving behind only pools of blood and the chilling echo of hurried footsteps. The city held its breath, a collective gasp. Everyone knew precisely who stood to gain from Alfonso's sudden, violent death. The Aragonese alliance had soured, and Naples was no longer politically useful to Alexander VI's grand ambitions. And Cesare Borgia, ever the serpent in the garden, had made no secret of his profound disdain for his brother-in-law. Lucrezia, cloaked in black mourning clothes, knelt beside her husband's corpse in the dim, flickering light of the chapel. His face was still strikingly beautiful in death, the violence of his end utterly at odds with the settled peace that now seemed to rest upon his features. She pressed a tender kiss to his cold forehead, her tears falling freely onto his still chest. "Who did this?" she whispered, her voice a ragged plea. The silent guards shifted uneasily. No one answered her, but Rome already had its chilling verdict. Cesare arrived at dawn, his heavy boots tracking mud across the chapel floor. He stood over Alfonso's body, his expression utterly unreadable, a stone mask. Lucrezia did not look up at him. "You mourn too loudly," he said at last, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "The Aragonese will use your grief as a weapon against us." Her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, trembled violently. "Did you do it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Cesare exhaled slowly through his nose, a sound almost like regret, or perhaps just weariness. He was a threat. "You know this." Lucrezia's breath hitched, a choked gasp. Alfonso had been many things, a prince of Naples, a pawn in her father's ruthless games, but he had never been a threat to her. He had brought her music, poetry, fleeting moments of genuine tenderness in a world that relentlessly demanded steel. And now he was gone, brutally extinguished. Cesare reached for her, but she recoiled sharply, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "The world is not kind to women who love too freely," he said coldly, his voice flat. "I spared you the pain of learning that lesson too late." The words were a knife, cruelly twisted in her ribs. Outside the chapel, the whispers had already begun. The Borgias had murdered their own, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last. But this death was different. This was no cardinal who had outlived his usefulness, no rival who had merely crossed the family. This was Lucrezia's husband, the man who held her heart. And if Cesare could do this, what else was he truly capable of? The rumors exploded like gunpowder. Pamphlets circulated within hours, their ink still wet, depicting Cesare as a monstrous Cain and Lucrezia as a weeping, innocent Abel. The Borgias' myriad enemies seized on the moment, their voices dripping with mock sympathy. What kind of brother kills his sister's love? Unless the love was his to claim all along. Lucrezia's grief was publicly displayed, but her profound rage was kept fiercely private. She withdrew to her chambers, refusing all visitors, even her father, who sent conciliatory gifts of jewels and perfumes that she left untouched. For the first time in her turbulent life, the beautiful daughter had been utterly betrayed, and Rome would never, ever let her forget it. Alfonso's murder became the grim linchpin of the Borgia mythos, undeniable proof that no one, not even family, was truly safe from their treacherous machinations. The whispers of incest, once dismissed as mere slander, now took on a sinister, undeniable weight. Why else would Cesare eliminate a rival for Lucrezia's affections? Why else would a pope allow his own son to slaughter his daughter's husband? The answers, real or imagined, painted a picture too monstrous, too depraved to ignore. Cesare, ever pragmatic, seemed utterly indifferent to the uproar. When a Spanish envoy dared to question him, he merely smiled, offering the man a glass of wine. "Accidents happen," he said lightly, casually. The envoy wisely declined the drink. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became a ghost in her own palace. Her ladies reported hearing her weep at night, but by day she was a statue, beautiful, untouchable, her emotions locked away where no one could see them. Only once did she break her profound silence. At a private mass for Alfonso's tormented soul, she turned to her brother, her voice barely audible, raw with pain. "You took him from me." Cesare's gaze did not waver. "I protected you." She laughed then, a brittle, shattering sound like breaking glass. "No, you only proved what they all say about us." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing alone in the flickering candlelight, the grim architect of his own damnation. Alfonso's blood had irrevocably sealed the Borgia's fate. From that night forward, the world would see them not just as corrupt, not just as ruthless, but as something far worse, a family that relentlessly devoured its own. And Lucrezia, the eternal pawn, had learned the hardest lesson of all. In the House of Borgia, even true love was a death sentence. The Vatican's sacred corridors whispered with the rustle of silk and the heavy scent of perfume long after Vespers. Pope Alexander VI, God's chosen vicar on earth, held court by day in his sacred vestments, but by night, the robes slipped away, revealing a man of insatiable earthly appetites. His mistresses moved through the apostolic palace like alluring shadows, their laughter echoing where solemn hymns should have reigned. Giulia Farnese, famously called La Bella for the cascading golden hair that tumbled down her back, was the most infamous. Barely 16 when she first caught the Pope's eye, she quickly became his openly acknowledged concubine, her likeness even painted as the Virgin Mary in Vatican frescoes, a blasphemy that made even jaded cardinals blanch. Then there was Venanza dei Catanii, mother of his 4 eldest children, her powerful influence lingering like smoke long after their affair cooled, and others whose names history barely recorded, fleeting figures in the papal bed. Rome had tolerated popes with mistresses before, but Alexander defiantly flaunted his sins. He hosted lavish banquets where his lovers openly dined beside bishops, their jewels glinting provocatively in the candlelight. He bestowed titles and vast lands upon his bastards, seating them above princes of the church, a public affront. His daughter, Lucrezia, born of Venazia, was meticulously groomed for dynastic marriages, while his son Cesare, once a cardinal, cast aside his robes to become a ruthless warlord. The hypocrisy was truly breathtaking. He preaches chastity from the pulpit and practices debauchery in his chambers. A Venetian envoy wrote home, sealing the letter hastily with wax before the ubiquitous Borgia spies could intercept it. The Pope's enemies needed no further ammunition. If Alexander could so openly defy the sacred vows of celibacy, what other sacred lines would he brazenly cross? The whispers slithered from the taverns to the very conclaves. A man who keeps mistresses might also keep his own daughter as one. The incest rumor, once seemingly outrageous, now found fertile, receptive ground. Even his own courtiers grew visibly uneasy. Cardinal Sforza, no stranger to vice himself, instinctively crossed himself when he saw Julia Farnese perched casually on the arm of the papal throne. "God sees," he muttered to a colleague. "God forgives," came the cynical reply. "But the people do not." Alexander seemed utterly unconcerned. He doted on his children, legitimate or not, with a fierce pride that bordered on idolatry. When Lucrezia turned 16, he gifted her an entire palace of her own, its walls hung with tapestries depicting nymphs and satyrs in playful abandon. When Cesare demanded command of the papal armies, Alexander dissolved his cardinal's robes with a casual wave of his hand. The message was chillingly clear: blood came before God. The mistresses, for their part, played their complex roles with cunning. Julia, ever the survivor, actively curried favor with Lucrezia, binding the girl to her with lavish gifts and whispered confidences. Venazia, though set aside, remained a formidable power in Rome's underworld, her inns and brothels humming with invaluable secrets. They knew their immense worth to Alexander, and they knew the brutal price of falling from his grace. But it was Lucrezia who paid the highest, most profound price. Every time her father paraded a new lover, every time he publicly kissed Julia's hand or let his fingers linger too long on a serving girl's waist, the insidious rumors about her gained further credence. If the Pope himself had no shame, what boundaries truly remained? The final outrage came when Alexander, in a fit of paternal casualness, hosted a ball to celebrate the birth of yet another bastard, this one by a woman so strikingly young the guests averted their eyes in discomfort. That night, as wine flowed freely and dancers swirled in a dizzying display, a Spanish bishop dared to approach the papal throne. "Holiness," he ventured hesitantly, "is this seemly?" Alexander, his arm draped casually around Julia's waist, laughed until his jowls shook with mirth. "Seemly," he echoed, raising his cup. "We are all God's children, are we not?" The bishop retreated, his face ashen with shock. Within weeks, the shocking story had spread to every corner of Europe, embellished wildly with each telling. By the time it reached Paris, the ball had become a monstrous orgy, the infant a demon, and Lucrezia, always Lucrezia, the willing participant in her father's unspeakable sins. Alexander's mistresses were not the crime. The crime was his brazenness, his utter, contemptuous disregard for the very pretense of piety. In a world where power relied inherently on perception, he had ripped away the veil, and in doing so, he made every vile rumor about his family seem terrifyingly possible. For why would a man who so openly defied God's laws stop at the profound taboo of incest? As Julia Farnese once quipped to a lover, her voice dripping with honeyed malice, "When the Pope plays the devil, who's to say where the performance ends?" The question haunted Lucrezia's every step, and Rome, ever eager for scandal, already knew its answer. The summer of 1503 was stifling, the air thick with the acrid stench of the Tiber's sluggish waters and the sweat of a city on edge, simmering under the immense weight of its own corruption. At its very heart, Pope Alexander VI, once deemed untouchable, now moved like a man hunted, his jowls sagging, his hands trembling slightly, and his laughter, once a booming force that shook the Vatican's gilded halls, had dulled to a rasping cough. On the evening of August 18th, Alexander dined with Cardinal Adriano de Corneto at a villa just outside the city walls. The meal was lavish, as all Borgia gatherings were. Roasted pheasant, figs dripping with honey, rich wine from the Pope's private cellars. But as the night wore on, the guests noticed something gravely amiss. The Pope, usually a glutton for both food and vibrant conversation, picked listlessly at his plate, his face ashen. "Holiness, are you unwell?" Corneto ventured cautiously. Alexander waved a dismissive hand. A trifle, the heat perhaps, but by midnight he was writhing in agony. Servants carried him back to the Vatican, his robes drenched in clammy sweat, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Physicians were swiftly summoned, their diagnoses whispered behind cupped hands. Some spoke of tertian fever, others of a mere surfeit of rich food. But Rome, ever suspicious, had a far darker theory: poison. The rumors spread like wildfire. Had the Della Roviers finally succeeded where their armies had failed? Had the Sforzas, still seething over Lucrezia's annulled marriage, slipped venom into the papal wine? Or, more chillingly, had God himself delivered divine retribution upon a man who had so brazenly defied every sacred law? Cesare, returning from campaign in the Romagna, found his father's chambers in utter chaos. The once mighty pope lay shrunken beneath silk sheets, his skin mottled, his eyes darting wildly in delirium. At his bedside, Lucrezia clutched a vial of holy water, her lips moving in silent, desperate prayer. "Who did this?" Cesare demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. The physicians exchanged uneasy glances. Nature, perhaps. Or the symptoms resemble Cantarella. The word hung in the air like a curse. Cantarella, the Borgia's own signature weapon, the poison rumored to leave no trace. The irony was bitter. Had Alexander fallen victim to his own merciless methods? Cesare's face darkened, a storm brewing. He turned to his sister. Who was with him last? Lucrezia's hands trembled. Corneto. But surely Corneto. Cesare spat the name like venom. "A de la rovere pon." But even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt danced in his eyes. Poison was often deemed a woman's weapon, some said. Had a spurned mistress sought vengeance? A cuckolded husband? Or was this the work of a far closer hand, one shrouded in familial darkness? Alexander's final hours were a grotesque spectacle. He raved of demons, of unseen flames licking at his feet. At times he called weakly for Lucrezia, his voice cracking with something akin to raw fear. "Daughter, forgive me." Other times he lashed out, hurling incoherent curses at shadows only he could see. On the third day, as the sun set in a blaze of scarlet, the Pope's breath finally stilled. Silence fell heavy over the Vatican. Then, from the streets below, a sound began. First a murmur, then a rising roar. The people of Rome, long oppressed by Borgia rule, poured into the piazzas, their voices rising in a cacophony of grief, relief, and sheer, stunned disbelief. The Pope was dead. The reign of terror was over. Or so they desperately hoped. In the apostolic palace, Cesare stood over his father's corpse, his face utterly unreadable. Lucrezia, her cheeks streaked with fresh tears, reached for his hand. He did not take it. "This changes nothing," he said softly, his voice hollow. "We are still Borgias, but outside, the wolves were already circling. The Della Roviers, the Sforzas, the Orsinis all saw their chance. The papal throne was vacant, and with it, The Borgia's immense power now hung by a precarious thread. And as the first stones were hurled at the Vatican's gates, one question burned hotter than the August sun. Had Alexander's death been murder or the swift, vengeful hand of a wrathful god? Rome would never agree on the definitive answer. But one thing was tragically certain. The Borgia era was ending, and it would end as it had always lived in blood. Without Alexander's iron grip on the papacy, Rome turned on the Borgias like a pack of starving wolves. Cesare, once the invincible prince commanding the church's armies, found himself adrift, his formidable power unraveling. His father's death had severed the vital strings of his influence, and the new pope, Pius III, lasted only weeks before the Della Rovere faction secured the throne for Julius II, their longtime, implacable enemy. The Borgia's golden age was irrevocably over. Cesare fled Rome under cover of night, his armor traded for the humble garb of a mere merchant, his infamous swagger reduced to the hurried, furtive steps of a desperate fugitive. But even in exile, his name still carried too much weight, too much infamy. Captured in Naples by Gonzalo de Córdoba, the Spanish general who had once been his ally, Cesare was ignominiously thrown into a dank dungeon, his destiny no longer his own to command. The news reached Lucrezia in Ferrara, where she had painstakingly rebuilt her life as the Duchess of Este. The letter trembled in her hands as she read of her brother's imprisonment, first in Spain, then in the bleak, remote fortress of La Modu. The man who had once commanded vast armies now slowly rotted in a cold, dark cell, his enemies savoring his profound downfall. "He will not last the winter," her informant wrote. The Spanish king has no love for traitors. Lucrezia did not weep. She had shed too many tears for the Borgias already. Instead, she folded the letter precisely and tucked it into the folds of her gown, her face a mask of resolute composure. But in the privacy of her chambers, she pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the windowsill and whispered a name she had not spoken in years. Cesare. His ignoble end came swiftly. In 1507, barely 4 years after their father's death, Cesare Borgia died in a minor skirmish in Navarre, cut down not by a rival general's strategic hand, but by a nameless soldier's mundane spear. The man who had once been the terror of all Italy fell ignobly, his body left unceremoniously to the crows. When word reached Ferrara, Lucrezia ordered a solemn mass for his soul. She knelt in the grand cathedral, her black veil hiding her face, her lips moving in silent prayer. The courtiers whispered. Was she mourning the brother who had loved her too fiercely, perhaps too possessively? Or the monster who had destroyed so much around her? Perhaps both. For Lucrezia, Cesare's death was the final, decisive severing of her tumultuous past. With him gone, the last living tether to the infamous Borgia name was cut. No longer merely the Pope's daughter, no longer the warlord's sister. She was free, if such a thing were truly possible, to be only herself. Lucrezia, Duchess of Ferrara, a woman who had defiantly outlived the very legends that had sought to define and trap her. But the scars remained. In the quiet hours of the night, she sometimes dreamed of Rome, of golden halls and poisoned feasts, of a brother's possessive grip and a father's calculating, manipulative smile. She would wake, gasping, her fingers clutching the sheets, the unsettling echoes of their voices still ringing in her ears. Yet by dawn, she was always impeccably composed. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival was not about escaping the past. It was about burying it so deeply that no one, not even she herself, could hear its lingering whispers. And so she lived, not as a Borgia, but as something else entirely, a woman who had miraculously survived them. Ferrara, 1519. The ducal palace rose like a formidable fortress of marble and light, its sprawling gardens fragrant with orange blossoms and the soothing murmur of fountains. Here, far from the poisoned intrigues of Rome, Lucrezia Borgia, now Lucrezia d'Este, walked the sunlit corridors as a woman seemingly reborn. Her third marriage had proven to be her salvation. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was no lovesick poet like her ill-fated Alfonso of Aragon, nor a mere pawn like Giovanni Sforza. He was a shrewd ruler in his own right, pragmatic and utterly unshaken by the persistent whispers that trailed his notorious bride. When he had first met Lucrezia, his gaze had been assessing, not leering. "I care little for gossip," he had told her plainly, directly, only for loyalty, and so Lucrezia had vowed to be fiercely loyal. She threw herself into her new role with a fervent dedication that surprised even her. No longer the passive ornament of the Vatican, she became Ferrara's beating heart, a patron of poets, a staunch protector of the arts, a devoted mother to her growing brood of D'Este children. The people, wary at first of the infamous Borgia daughter, soon whispered of her genuine kindness. How she fed the poor during famine, how she knelt for hours in the cathedral, her devotion seemingly unfeigned. But redemption, she knew, was never so simple. The past clung to her like a persistent shadow. When she hosted lavish masquerades, guests still murmured behind their masks. Did she poison her rivals? Did she bet her brother? The malicious pamphlets followed her, smuggled into Ferrara by visiting merchants, their dark ink staining her new life with old, indelible sins. Even her own ladies, though outwardly devoted, sometimes flinched subtly when she reached for their hands. One evening, as she walked the palace gardens with her youngest son cradled tenderly in her arms, her husband joined her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "They still talk," Alfonso said without preamble, his voice low and knowing. Lucrezia did not pretend to misunderstand. "They always will. Does it trouble you?" he inquired. She looked down at her son, his innocent face untouched by the world's cruelties. "Once it would have," she admitted quietly. Then she exhaled slowly, watching a single petal drift from a blooming rose. "Let them whisper. I know who I am." Alfonso studied her, his expression unreadable, yet understanding. "You are my wife, the mother of my heirs. That is all that matters." But Lucrezia knew better. The Borgia name could not be so easily shed. Cesari's ghost haunted her still. News of his death had come like a thunderclap, a brutal, ignoble end for a brutal man. She had mourned him in secret, lighting candles in a private chapel where no one could see her tears. The brother who had loved and betrayed her, who had shaped her destiny as surely as her father had, was gone. And with him, the last living witness to the girl she had once been. Yet even in Ferrara, the rumors found her. When a traveling friar preached in the piazza of the Scarlet Woman whose sins could never be washed clean, the crowd's eyes flicked instinctively toward the palace. Alfonso had the man expelled, but the damage was already done. Lucrezia's greatest battle was not for power, but for memory. She could not rewrite the past, but she could tirelessly shape the future. She commissioned portraits that showed her as the pious duchess, the devoted mother. She endowed convents, her name etched forever into the cold stone of charitable foundations. She made certain that history would remember her as more than merely a Borgia. And yet, on the anniversary of her father's death, she stood alone in her chambers, a goblet of wine in hand. The years had softened her features, but not the deep, lingering weight in her eyes. She lifted the cup in a silent toast, her whisper barely audible. "To the house of Borgia, may its curses finally die with me." Outside, the bells of Ferrara rang, their peals clean and bright, signaling the close of day. The world moved on. But Lucrezia would always wonder, had she truly escaped the curse, or was she simply its last, lonely keeper? The answer, like her enduring legacy, was ultimately not hers to decide. The Borgia myth endures, not because it is entirely true, but because it is utterly irresistible. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia took her last breath in Ferrara, since Cesari's blood soaked the soil of Navarre, since Alexander VI's corpulent body was laid to rest in a tomb that would later be desecrated by his vengeful enemies. Yet the whispers persist, the insidious rumors of incest, the chilling tales of poison, and the unspeakable sins cling to their name like a pervasive shadow that no amount of diligent historical scrutiny can ever fully dispel. Why? The answer lies in the very nature of power and the compelling stories we tell ourselves to make sense of it. The Borgias were indeed guilty of much: bribery, cold-blooded murder, blatant nepotism, ruthless betrayal. But these were, in many ways, the ordinary crimes of Renaissance politics, the common currency of every ambitious ruling house from Florence to Venice. What made the Borgias unique was their audacious brazenness. They openly flaunted their sins in an age that relentlessly demanded meticulous hypocrisy. Alexander VI kept mistresses openly, seated his bastard children alongside powerful princes, and transformed the Vatican into a blatant theater of shocking excess. Cesare abandoned his cardinal's robes for a conqueror's armor, his ambition as naked and sharp as his blade. And Lucrezia, beautiful, enigmatic Lucrezia, played the game with a deceptive grace that made her perceived complicity seem all the more damning. Their real crimes were certainly monstrous enough, but reality is often less satisfying, less compelling than myth. The incest rumor endured because it was the perfect slander, unprovable, unforgettable, and utterly corrosive. In a world where the church tirelessly preached morality while simultaneously practicing profound corruption, the idea of a pope bedding his own daughter was the ultimate, most damning indictment of hypocrisy. It reduced the Borgias' complex political machinations to something primal, something that bypassed reason and lodged firmly in the collective imagination like a barbed, unshakable hook. And perhaps, on some deeper level, people desperately wanted to believe it. The Borgias represented the darkest fantasies of unchecked power. They were the terrifying monsters lurking just behind the gilded facade of the Renaissance, compelling proof that even God's chosen could, in fact, be demons in disguise. Their legends served both as a dire warning and a perverse thrill. To merely paint them as ordinary sinners was mundane. To paint them as abominations was unforgettable. Lucrezia, in particular, became a blank canvas for every fear and fascination of her age. Was she a helpless victim or a depraved villain, a mere pawn or a cunning player? The truth, as always, was far murkier, far more nuanced than the enduring myth. She was a woman navigating a brutally patriarchal world that offered her no genuinely good choices, her agency circumscribed by the powerful men who controlled her fate. But history, in its relentless simplification, often prefers its women to be either saints or whores, and Lucrezia's uncomfortable complexity was simply too inconvenient for such neat, easily digestible categorization. The Borgia myth says less about them than it does about us. It starkly reveals our insatiable hunger for stories that confirm our deepest suspicions, that power corrupts absolutely, that beauty often masks profound depravity, that the very institutions we rely on are as rotten as the flawed people who lead them. The Borgias did not invent these unsettling truths. They merely embodied them with a theatrical flair that ensured their eternal infamy. And so the alluring lies outlive the sober truth. The venomous pamphlets of Renaissance Rome have become the accepted history books of today, their ink long faded, but their potent poison undimmed. We still speak of Lucrezia's alleged crimes, of Cesari's monstrous appetites, of Alexander's unholy lusts. We do so because the alternative to accept that they were merely human, flawed, and ruthless in ordinary ways is somehow less viscerally satisfying. In the end, the Borgias' true legacy is not simply the crimes they committed, but the compelling, dark stories we stubbornly refuse to let die. And perhaps that, above all else, was their greatest, most enduring sin.